One thing my dad did was, and when he drank, he got a little bit braver. Now you have to understand that, but he every now and then he would catch a chicken snake, and the chicken snakes would come in a chicken house and try to get the eggs, and they'd swallow the eggs whole, and then they'd go out to a bush or a tree, and they'd curl around that tree, and they'd crush it, and that would be some of their way they would eat. And before I get this, well, sometimes we put clay eggs in there with the chickens, and sometimes later on we got glass eggs, and we put those in there too. And if the snake was not bright enough to get a real egg, instead of got one of those, went out there and crushed it. Well, first of all, the clay egg just wouldn't hardly crush it, and of course the glass egg did, and that ended probably that snake's life. But my dad, chicken snakes, they wouldn't bite you. They didn't have any fangs or anything like that. They just had a big old mouth that opened, swallow the egg, and they get 4 or 5 feet long too. And my dad would sometimes, like I said, if he came in from town and we caught one out in the chicken house, well, he would go along there and catch that snake by the tail, and before that snake could curl up, he would take that old snake and he would just whale that old snake around like that and go, ka-choom! That old snake's head would just go, floop, pop right out, pop right off. And that didn't happen all the time, but he did that, and that always stood in my mind too, because I didn't have the courage to do that. But anyway, he did that, and my dad always got up around 4 o'clock, and he would. Well, we'd go to bed early, of course. We didn't have any electricity, and we'd go to bed pretty early and get up early. And the wood stoves were all right, but they just didn't give out much. They just didn't give out much heat unless you were real close. I mean, those things would get sometime almost red hot. And then to decorate them the other day, we used to paint them with aluminum paint. And the first few times, the aluminum paint wore off after it got hot enough. It kind of had a little odor, but they just kind of get red hot. But of course, during the night, the wood would burn down probably around 10, 11, 12 o'clock, and then it would just die on down. So Dad would get up about 4 o'clock every morning and fire up that wood stove, and it was a scraper that you'd pull out the ashes, and then he had a little shovel and had a bucket and put all those ashes in there and clean all that stuff out, because if you didn't clean it out real good, the wood wouldn't start burning near as good, and you got to clean it out eventually. So we just about did it every time, and then he'd take those ashes out and put in fresh wood, and we kept wood in the house because if it was raining, it wouldn't start very good, and he would put paper and a little kerosene and whatever and pile that wood in there and light it. And I don't know if he went back to bed or not, I can't remember, but by the time I got up, I could get up there and be fairly warm by that stove. And speaking of warm, because every room in the house was just cold. I mean, it was just cold, and slept on his old, just a mattress, and had an old iron bed, and had old iron springs that were exposed. It wasn't covered like now. I mean, it was just old flat old iron springs. And we had a feather bed. It was literally a feather bed made out of feathers. It was very heavy. And I'm gonna tell you, when you crawl in that thing for about 4 or 5 minutes, you would just shiver. But once you got settled in there and formed your little pocket, I mean, it was just like heaven. It was so warm, and I mean, you just didn't move a whole lot because you didn't want to get over there. It was cold, but it was a great thing, and a lot of people had feather beds in those days. But it was very heavy, and he was just like kind of, I hate to say, but it wasn't solid. It was just soft and kind of thick, and but we used that a lot. And of course, baths we took in a number 3 wash tub in the house, right next to the stove, and I don't guess we bathed, but a couple times a week probably during the winter at best. And of course, the side facing the stove, you pretty darn warm, but the other side you weren't quite as warm. It was kind of, in fact, pretty cold. You didn't stay in there very long, and so that's how we kind of took our baths. And we got a little ice box, and of course you'd go to town and buy a block of ice. I think you buy a 25-pound block of ice. They came in 300-pound sections ice, and those guys that really worked at ice house, they take ice pick and go right down the line and chop out about 25 pounds each, and I mean, and then they take the hooks, they call them ice hooks, and put it on there. It had prongs in there, grabbing that ice and just pick it on up, and they'd wrap it up in paper so it wouldn't melt so fast, and then we'd take it home and open up the top and set that ice in there. And then we had a few, then we had another little door at the bottom, and had a few trays there, and that's where we'd put a few things we wanted to keep cool. And then that ice would melt, of course, and it would drain down. Had a little section where it drained down and came down a little pipe, and we would put a pan under there, and my job was always to empty that pan. That ice would last a couple, 3 days at best. And sometimes I forgot, and that darn water pan would overflow, and of course I was trying to slide it out real easy, and it was already up to the top, and we had just those old linoleum floors, and Mom wasn't too happy about me not emptying that pan earlier before it got so full, but that was kind of unique. We got that about 2 years before we moved to town. We moved to Holman, if I remember correctly. That's when we got that little ice box, and that was pretty uptown for a little bit there. But going back to one thing I forgot about was my cousin Leroy Reimers. We didn't have anything to speak of, but a year or two before we moved, we finally traded in we got a different car. Mom and Dad had been saving up money, a different car, because our old Model A was about gone, and I'll get back to Leroy in just a second. But cars were hard to find. You couldn't hardly find any cars those days. I mean, the war was on, and just couldn't hardly find them. And Mr. Boriak in Schulenburg, I don't know how Dad got connected with him, but I guess they had a waiting list and how much people would pay for a car, and whatever criteria they used. But anyhow, I don't know how he let my dad know about it, whether it was by letter or if he phoned somebody in Weimar and they came out and told him. Maybe that's what happened. But anyway, I remember we drove over to Schulenburg, and he came out with a 1939 black Ford with a flathead V8, and man, I thought that was the prettiest car I'd ever seen. And anyhow, I don't think my mom and dad had the cash, 100% cash. They probably borrowed some money from Mr. Hager at the bank, but we bought that car. and it still had the shift on the floor and all that, and so we drove that car to Wyoming, and it was so quiet. We stopped back there in Wyoming in the alley back in the back, and picked up little groceries, and that car was idling. I couldn't believe it. I mean, and and it had a gas gauge on it, and I looked at that, and he was a little bit low, and Mama said, I just pestered all the time about we're gonna run out of gas. So we had this 39 Ford, black. Most cars were black. But anyway, Leroy, they lived a few miles over from us, and their car was, I don't know what they had, even if they had one, but I guess they had something, but he was trying to date at that time, and so he came over, and my dad and Mom and Leroy got along real fine, and they were just good friends, and he would borrow my dad and Mom's 39 Ford occasionally and go out on a date. And Leroy could do a lot of things. He played in that band, of course, and he could play and dance and sing a little bit and all that. And so he could break horses too. So I had a horse named, all our horses are plow horses except Corina. Probably already said this before, but he came over there and Dad said, well, we're going to try to put a saddle on Corina. So anyhow, Leroy did that, and he rode old Corina and rode across those fields, and they were wet. And so, but get to the point, Corina never got really broke good, and so I was too scared to get on him, so I never got on that. But that was right after Leroy got back, and of course he was shot in the neck by a sniper, back of the neck, and just missed his spine. But I remember that he was in the hospital about 6 months while the war was going on, and he came home then, and the war might have been over, but maybe it wasn't quite then. But anyway, it was right near that time, and I know there was still some drainage on his neck from that wound, and I know my mom, she would change the bandages every now and then when he would come over, and he spent the night with us a few times. And but anyway, I got off on that story, but